What if the happiest moment of your life comes right before everything changes? This morning, there's no fear, no distance, no reason to leave. Just a simple meal, a quiet smile, and a little girl who finally feels safe again. For the first time, they look like a real family. But sometimes, peace doesn't mean the danger is gone. It just means it's waiting. Hello everyone, and welcome back to Lie to Diep VN. In today's episode, after everything they've been through, life finally begins to slow down for James, Diep, and Nee. The fear fades, the distance disappears, and for the first time, they begin to feel like a real family. A simple breakfast, a quiet moment, and a small memory from James's childhood slowly reveal something deeper, why he chose to stay, and what this place truly means to him. If you enjoy emotional stories about love, healing, and real-life relationships, please consider subscribing to the channel. We're on our way to 1,000 subscribers, and your support truly means the world to us. Now, let's continue the story. The morning came gently, not quiet in the way it used to be, not the kind of silence that carried tension underneath, but something softer, something lived in. Light filtered through the bamboo behind the house, falling in thin golden lines across the wooden floor. The air felt warm already, promising a long, slow day ahead. Inside, the house felt full, not crowded, just full of presence, of breath, of something that had finally settled. From the kitchen, a soft sound broke the stillness. Water boiling, a lid shifting slightly. James stood by the small stove, his sleeves rolled up, his movements steady and unhurried. He wasn't rushing. He wasn't distracted. He was simply there, focused, as if this simple act of cooking was exactly where he was meant to be. Behind him, a faint sound, small footsteps. He turned slightly. Nee stood near the doorway, holding onto the wooden frame with one hand. She still looked small, still a little weak, but something about her was different today. Her eyes were clearer, brighter. "You're awake," James said softly. Nee didn't answer right away. She just looked at him, then gave a small nod. James smiled faintly. Good. He turned back to the pot, lifting the lid carefully. Steam rose into the air. Warm, simple, nothing complicated, but enough. From the side of the room, Diep watched quietly. She had been there for a while, not interrupting, just observing the way he moved, the way he stayed, the way nothing about him felt temporary anymore. "You woke up early," she said gently. James glanced at her. "Couldn't sleep much." A small pause. "Thought I'd make something." Diep stepped closer, her eyes moving to the pot. "For her?" James nodded. "And for you." The words were simple, but they landed differently. Diep didn't respond right away. She just watched him for a moment longer. Then, "What is it?" James hesitated for a brief second, not because he didn't know the answer, but because the answer meant something. "Chicken claw," he said lightly. Diep frowned slightly. "Chicken claw?" James gave a small smile. "Yeah." He picked up a bowl and carefully scooped the food out. But what filled the bowl was not chicken, just soft pieces of boiled green squash. Plain, humble, almost too simple. Diep looked at it, then at him. That's not. I know, James said gently. A small pause. It's not really chicken. Nee stepped closer now, her small hands resting on the table as she looked into the bowl. Chicken claw? She repeated softly. James crouched slightly to her level. When I was little, he said, his voice calm, my mom used to make this for me. He held the bowl carefully. We didn't have much. A pause. So she would boil squash and tell me it was chicken. His voice didn't break, but something inside it shifted. Not sadness. Not exactly. Just memory. She said it would make me strong, he added with a faint smile. And I believed her. The room grew quiet. Not heavy. Just still. Diep watched him differently now, not just as the man who chose to stay, but as someone who had learned, long before this, what it meant to endure. Nee looked at the bowl again, then back at him. Is it good? She asked softly. James nodded. Very. A small pause. The best chicken claw you'll ever have. Nee hesitated, then slowly reached for the spoon. Carefully, she took a small bite. For a moment, everything seemed to pause. Then, it's good, she said quietly. Simple, but certain. James let out a small breath he hadn't realized he was holding. See? He said lightly. Nee nodded and took another bite. Diep turned slightly away. Not to leave, just to steady herself. Because the moment felt too real, too gentle. Thank you, she said softly. James looked at her. For what? Diep shook her head lightly. For everything. A pause. For being here. James didn't answer immediately. He just looked at her, then said quietly, I told you, this is where I want to be. This time, she didn't question it. She didn't overthink it. She simply accepted it. And that changed everything. The morning continued slowly. Not rushed. Not planned. Just unfolding. As the sun rose higher, the yard outside filled with light. The air warmed quickly, carrying the scent of earth and leaves. Diep stepped outside, holding a small basket of ripe bananas. Soft, almost too ripe, perfect for drying. She sat down in the yard and began slicing them into thin pieces with a small knife. Careful, steady. Inside, James finished cleaning up before stepping out. He paused at the doorway for a moment, watching her, the quiet rhythm of her hands. What are you doing? He asked. Diep didn't look up. Drying bananas. A pause. So they last longer. She lifted a slice slightly. For banana cake later. James nodded, looking at the setup, or rather, the lack of one. Just a small mat. Not enough. This won't hold much, he said. Diep shrugged. It's enough. James didn't reply. He looked around the yard, then toward the bamboo, then back at her. Wait here, he said. Diep frowned slightly. What are you? But he was already moving. A few minutes later, a sharp, rhythmic sound filled the air. Wood splitting. James stood near the side of the house, holding a piece of bamboo steady as he split it into long strips. His movements were controlled, precise, not clumsy, as if he understood exactly what he was doing, or at least, how to learn quickly. Diep stood and walked closer. You don't have to do that, she said. James didn't stop. It's fine. A pause. This will be better. He placed the split bamboo aside and picked up another piece. The sun had grown stronger now. The heat pressed down heavily. Sweat began to form along his forehead, but he didn't slow down. Diep watched him for a moment. Then, without saying anything, she stepped forward and held the next piece steady for him. James glanced at her briefly. No words, just acknowledgement, and continued. Time passed. Measured in movement, cutting, placing, tying, building, piece by piece. A simple bamboo rack began to take shape. Stronger, higher, enough to hold everything. When it was done, James stepped back slightly, breathing a little heavier. There. Diep looked at it, then at him. You've done this before? James wiped his forehead lightly. Not exactly. A small smile. But I learned fast. Diep let out a quiet breath. Almost a laugh. You really are, she started, then paused. James tilted his head. What? She looked at him, a softness in her eyes. You're starting to look like an old farmer. James blinked. An old farmer? Diep nodded, a faint smile forming. Yeah. James looked down at his hands, at the bamboo, at the sweat, then back at her. Then what does that make you? This time, Diep didn't hesitate. An old farmer's wife. For a moment, they both stood there. Then James laughed softly. Not loud, not exaggerated, just real. And Diep smiled. Fully. For the first time in a long time, they worked together after that. Side by side, placing the banana slices carefully onto the rack. Row by row, under the sun. No rush. No distance. Just rhythm. And somewhere between the heat, the quiet, and the small shared movements, something settled even deeper. Not dramatic. Not overwhelming. Just right. And for now, that was enough. The afternoon settled slowly over the house. The sun was no longer soft. It stood high now, steady and unforgiving, pressing warmth into the earth, into the wood, into the air itself. But the rhythm of the day didn't break. It simply slowed. Outside, the bamboo rack stood firm in the yard, lined neatly with rows of sliced bananas. The thin pieces glistened slightly under the sunlight, beginning their quiet transformation. Nearby, Diep adjusted one of the rows carefully, making sure each slice had space. Not too close, not overlapping, just right. Behind her, James leaned lightly against one of the wooden posts, watching, not idly, just present. You're very precise, he said after a moment. Diep didn't look up. If they stick together, they won't dry properly. James nodded. Of course. A small pause. Then, farmer knowledge. Diep glanced at him, a faint smile forming. You're learning fast. James pushed himself off the post slightly. I have a good teacher. Diep shook her head lightly, but she didn't deny it. A quiet stretch of time followed. The kind that didn't need to be filled. The kind that only existed when nothing felt urgent anymore. Then, a soft sound. From the doorway, both of them turned. Knee. She stood there again, holding onto the frame, watching them. This time, she stepped forward on her own, slow, but steady. Diep's attention shifted instantly. "You should be resting," she said gently. Nee shook her head slightly. "I'm okay." Her voice was still small, but clearer than before. James crouched slightly. "Want to help us?" he asked. Nee hesitated, then nodded. James picked up a small tray and placed it carefully in front of her. "Just put them here," he said, handing her a few slices. "Not too close together." Nee looked at the slices seriously, as if this task mattered. Then she carefully placed one down, then another. Slowly, focused, Diep watched her, something soft passing through her expression. "She's stronger," she said quietly. James nodded. "She is." A pause. "She's trying." Diep looked at him briefly. "So are you." James didn't respond. He didn't need to. The work continued like that. 3 people. 1 rhythm. Simple. Quiet. Real. And somewhere in between, the distance that once existed between them was gone. Later, when the rack was full and the sun had begun its slow descent, the air shifted again. Not cooler, but softer. The kind of warmth that no longer pressed, but lingered. Diep stood, stretching her arms slightly. "We should water the vegetables," she said. James nodded immediately. "I'll come with you." Diep looked at him. "You don't have to." "I know," he said. A small pause. "I want to." Diep held his gaze for a moment, then nodded. "Okay." The garden sat just beyond the house, closer to the edge of the bamboo. Small, modest. Rows of green plants stretched unevenly across the soil, some stronger than others, but all alive. Growing. Diep picked up a watering can, handing another to James. "Not too much," she said. "Just enough." James nodded. "Got it." They began, moving slowly between the rows, pouring water carefully, not rushing, not wasting, just enough. Nee followed behind them, staying close, watching more than helping this time. Every now and then, she would crouch slightly, touching a leaf, then standing again. Curious. Present. Alive. "You're doing it wrong," Diep said after a while. James looked up. "I am?" "You're pouring too close to the stem." He glanced down. "Oh." A small pause. "Does that matter?" Diep stepped closer, adjusting his hand slightly. "It does." Her fingers brushed against his for just a moment. Brief. Accidental. But neither of them pulled away immediately. "Like this," she said softly. James followed her movement. "Like this," he repeated. Diep nodded. "Yeah." For a second, they stayed like that. Close. Not touching anymore, but not distant either. Then, Diep stepped back, continuing her work. James watched her for a moment longer, then did the same. Time passed quietly again. The sound of water hitting soil, leaves shifting gently, Nee's small footsteps behind them, and beyond that, the bamboo. Always there, always moving. But today, something about it felt different, not louder, not obvious, just slightly out of rhythm. James paused for a moment, just for a second, his eyes shifting toward the bamboo line. Watching, listening, the leaves brushed against each other. Soft, continuous, but not entirely even. "What is it?" Diep asked, noticing. James blinked slightly, then shook his head. "Nothing." A pause. "Just thought I heard something." Diep followed his gaze toward the bamboo. For a moment, she listened too, but all she could hear was the wind. "It's just the bamboo," she said quietly. James nodded. "Yeah, maybe it was." They continued working, finishing the last few rows. The sky had begun to shift now, the light softening into a deeper gold. The day was ending. Slowly, gently, as it had begun. When they returned to the house, the banana slices outside had already started to dry at the edges. A small sign of time passing, of things continuing. James looked at the rack. "Not bad for our first day as farmers." Diep crossed her arms lightly. "Our first day?" James smiled. "Feels like it." Diep looked at the house, at the yard, at the bamboo beyond, then back at him. "It does." A small pause. "Like we've always been here." James didn't respond immediately. He just looked at her. Then, "Maybe we have," he said softly. Diep didn't argue. She didn't question it. She simply let the moment exist. Nee sat quietly on the small wooden step, watching them. Tired now, but peaceful. Safe. James walked over, crouching slightly. "Time to rest," he said gently. Nee nodded. This time, without resistance. He helped her inside. Careful. Steady. Diep watched them from the doorway. The way he moved. The way he stayed. The way nothing about him felt temporary anymore. As the sun dipped lower, the shadows of the bamboo stretched longer across the yard, reaching, touching the edge of the house, slowly, quietly, almost unnoticed. The wind moved again, soft, but this time, for just a brief second, the leaves didn't move with it. They moved, slightly after, as if something deeper inside the bamboo had shifted first. James stepped back outside for a moment, just to check the rack, just to look. His eyes drifted again, toward the bamboo. Still, quiet, nothing there. And yet, he didn't look away immediately. From inside the house, a small voice. "James." He turned instantly. Nee stood in the doorway, looking at him. "Come inside." James held her gaze for a second, then nodded. "Yeah." He took one last look at the bamboo, then stepped inside. Behind him, the wind passed through the trees again, soft, endless, familiar. But somewhere deep within the shadows, something had already begun to move, quietly, waiting.